Hello and welcome back to this ongoing series. And we've just to remind our viewers, new viewers, of the context of this holy experiment, so to speak. A biographer was asking me, posthumous, when I'm no longer here. When I'm no longer here, but I'm let go of Ashok, let go of Gangadean. Gangadean is not here, that version. And if he, she were to create a story of Ashok's life, his contributions over 60 plus years as a global philosopher, first philosopher, seeking to understand with all the great first responders of history in our scriptures and enlightenment teachings of first philosophers, seeking to get to what is first, that there is a first, that there is a foundation of reality, of being. There is being. It's called first philosophy. What would be the highlights of his journey over 60 years, building upon and with the great first responders? It's a good name for first responders because what is first is calling all of us all the time, if we're sensitive and open to it. The infinite space of presence of let's use the word logos. When we're living here in the red zone, under a code of software of the mind that we brought this out before, and the hologram is new, introduced by Gangadean over years of his research as a logician, East and West, following the development of logic, the science of consciousness, through the centuries over the 2,500 years. And so I was responding to this biographer of the life of Gangadean. What were the high points of his life work as a first philosopher, a global philosopher, a new field and frontier of research, building upon all of our great first responders through the ages, responding to what is first, and pioneering. These are the great pioneers. Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Sartre, Heidegger, Wittgenstein. All these are just a sample of minds, just in the lineage of the biblical tradition. What was happening in the lineage for Abraham, children of Abraham, the Judeo-Christian, Muslim traditions alone of scriptures, that's first responding. Yahweh is first. Allah is first in primary being, the source, the ground. And being infinite, it's the source of all. And so whether in the Yahweh tradition, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, all the way through the centuries are great theologians and men and women, mystics who are attempting to get to what is first and the grammar of what's first. Yahweh, or the Logos, using when John said in the beginning is the Logos, the infinite word, and that the Hellenistic Yahweh and the Hellenistic Logos, the light of reason, and the Hebraic, scripture, they're connected in some way. That's why John would say in the beginning is the Logos for Yahweh. And the same can be said for Allah, the infinite first. So whenever you get an infinite source, they're connected profoundly. We got that in Gangadean's journey. I'm just trying to warm up for this session, which is a fourth trailer, because what I agreed to do would be, I'll step back from Ashok, Gangadean, and the usual ways of telling a bio story here. Since his work was to break this barrier, which the red zone source code, and to enter into a deeper space of the fundamental field of what is first. This is where our great first responders are responding to the call of the infinite. And the double parenthesis, the double bracket sign is a notation for the infinite word, the Logos, and the red is for our stage of information, talking about it, this level of language, of reason, of being a human, of cultures, all our narratives going on here, but they're always being called by and the first responders were the ones who are seeking to open the way from this glass ceiling, the red ceiling, and the mind operating software, which is holding us back from a deeper access to the language of the Zohar, the language of the source of what is first. So the first responders were pioneers in the science of what is first, whatever name we use. And I'm suggesting the word logos, not logos in the Greek sense, but logos in the global space of all. So Yahweh here is not Yahweh here. Allah here is not Allah. God here is not God. Jesus Christ is not Christ. Buddha is not Buddha. Krishna is not Krishna. Muhammad is not Muhammad. Lao Tzu is not Lao Tzu, on and on, all through the centuries. 2,500 years of experimentation and moving from a more derivative way of being in the world, of being a human, of thinking being is here, to going into. So when I make the gesture of the double braid, I'm talking about the deeper language of source, or the original language, the fundamental word, the foundation. And so we didn't have that notational clarity before. This hologram is new. We didn't have the global space opened up and the code markers for when you're in the language and reason and life and mind here, and when we are in this stage of evolution, which was marked out in the red in the earlier sessions. This was just a review I'm doing right now to try and recall some of the headlines of 1, 2, and 3, episode trailers 1, 2, and 3, and now I'm about to do trailer number 4, which is going to focus on the first responders over 2,500 years on a global scale that we couldn't see together before. Why? Because they were in silos, they were separate. Yahweh, Allah, Buddha, Krishna, God, Lao Tzu, Om, Tao, Brahman, they're all inside. When I say silos, I mean they're in their own space. And what's doing that? Well, the mind software we saw, the legomental, Lego pieces, X, whatever the word is here, X, in this language is a unit, an alleged unit, an atom, a piece, having its own ID. It's an ontological atom, a logical atom, a psychological atom, an epistemological atom, whatever, it's an atom. What's an atom? A unit allegedly by itself. But what the great first responders saw, and this came out in the first 3 attempts to help the biographer, posthumous presentation of Gangadean's life and work and findings. And I'm assisting in that. I'm daring to do this experiment and say, okay, I'll seek to step back from my own CV and that version of me and speak, which is my whole journey in life, was to move from here to here into the global space as a global philosopher. First philosophy is here. First scriptures are here. The foundation of culture is here. The foundation of truth and reason and ethics are all in crossing from the ego Lego space to the logos space. We're not Lego sapiens, this is Lego units, but logos. Every point here is connected with every other point in the fractal space of the logosphere. The Yahweh sphere, the Allah sphere, the Buddha sphere, all of these are meeting here. Here there's in silos. But when you cross into the source word, the source that they were all pioneering for, the first responders, when Buddha was opening up enlightenment here, when Krishna was teaching the yoga here, when Socrates is saying, leave the cave and come into the logos, and know thyself here, when Moses is at the burning bush here, when Jesus is sacrificing to help people move from here to here, when Muhammad is surrender to Allah, what is that? Surrender this for what is first. The great first forces were calling by all of these great, amazing, noble traditions over the centuries. We're all saying we have to put first. And if we're living in a derivative, if we're making this first, our agenda, our wills, our narrative, our language form, our form of reason, by our wills here. First, if we're firsting this, then we're eclipsing and cutting off access to being, to self, to truth, to being, to reality, to what is first. So what happens in this episode, and the fourth coaching for a prospective biographer that was going to really sum up simply in the most efficient way for public viewers, what were the highlights of Gangadean's life and breakthrough, the pioneering the frontier of global philosophy and introducing, for the first time in history, the code notation markers to understand what is the logo of logos. It's this. What is the code of everyday life, the Lego space, which is amazing. Talk about it, language here, Google information, and using language and words in this linguistic and mental and rational space, which is a great stage of evolution on our way to the source of who we truly are as Logos kids, as Logos sapiens, not Lego sapiens, not in silos, but tapping the UnumPluribus. That's huge. What is Unum? The infinite unifying force of what is first. What is Pluribus? The vast, infinite, boundless diversity that is always unumized. So Pluribus, multiplicity, is still woven together. And nothing can be broken into separate units, atomic units. It has its own alleged being. You can't be without being. This is a space of being, of reality, of what is first. So in the first three episodes, we saw some of the headlines, and what I wish to do in this fourth coaching episode, in the posthumous voice of Gangadean's gone, and what did he bring through as a first philosopher in a global space, a global first philosopher, which is a new frontier, with the notation. And what we've seen in the first three trailers, these are only trailers because Gangadean's life in great detail has been developing this over decades in his teaching, in his public appearances, and the global forums he held at Haverford College, where he was a professor for over 50 years. And he was the Margaret Guest Professor of Global Philosophy at Haverford College in the Center for Bringing Worlds Together in Dialogue, in deep dialogue, not monologue, but dialogue. Because worlds in this derivative space are worlds apart, they're separate. They're worlds apart, they can't communicate, but when you go into the logos, where dialogue means dialogos, through the logos, go deeper, dare to go deeper from monologue to dialogue, to bring our diverse worlds together. And if, say, USA is a multicultural, multi-world, multi-perspective, multi-world views, culture of different, with gender, ethnicity, all of this going on in the USA here, can we find a more perfect Unum? An UnumPluribus, e pluribus unum, which is the mantra of America. For example, I'm just giving you an example. What I'm doing in this fourth trailer is, who were the first responders that were hitherto in silos, and therefore we couldn't even dare to put them together and saying they are all being called by the infinite force. They're all responders to logos. Moses is responding to logos, the infinite first. I'm using that word. You could put Yahweh there, Allah there, Brahman there, Tao there, Om there. All of these alternative names for what is first. What is first is infinitely one. You can't have more than one in this sense. One or two or three are infinites, or one or two or three names for the infinites. They cannot but be coming out of the same Unum, infinite unified force. So we needed a name and a hologram to see that what was going on here in reading our scriptures and reading our philosophers and trying to make sense of them in this mental, rational, linguistic space of language and thought, goes to a much deeper space when you cross this barrier and step back from this code and becoming mindful. Because here we're minding inside the space, but when we become mindful and see this is a software that has malware effects, according to our great first teachers, we'll see that when we end the silo of our great first teachers and say our first responders were all responding to the call of the source. And so you will see that now. So some of the headlines from the first three episodes, and I'm going to pick it up here. This is still just a a warm-up reflection. So where are we in the fourth? This is the fourth trailer, building on the first three. And if you're coming for the first time, or if you're just coming back and you've sampled the first three, it'll fade. And I'm trying to refresh our minds in preparation for this one, which is the first responders. Let's get several of those great samples of our history, 2,500 years, and quickly fast forward. In this trailer, it's not going to try and go in depth. That's happened over decades in Gangadean's life. As I said, in his teaching, in his public performances, and his writings, and his books, and various video performances on his websites, and work he's done with his son, Nathan Saith, over decades, his partnership and colleagues in bringing this journey from derivative to primary. So very quickly, what we've seen for just the introduction of the code markers itself is a monumental breakthrough that changes the whole understanding of our history. Once we see the missing hologram, that this language and space of reality, of being is here, it's not here. And calling this out, we should perhaps even make this more dramatic. It's so monumental. This is the code that we're living in. We humans, however long it took to evolve to tame the logos and get it under control. Here, as you've seen, I'm not going to rehearse what we've done before. If you've missed the first three, go please, if this interests you, and it should interest every human being, all people, because this is public. We have a right to reason. Humans have a right to reason, to rationality, a right to our being. We have a right to be, and that's here. And here, it's a subspace. It's not our full being. It's a stage. We can talk about it. We could have our CV. We could have our narratives. We could have our belief systems. We could have our worldviews, or even multiple worldviews. They're all going on under the sway of this derivative code. I can make this a little prettier here. This should not. Here we go. Right, this is a huge glass ceiling. That is, but now the first responders were crossing this barrier. They were beginning to see this. Through the power of this, the logos, they were responding to the call of logos. So logos here, the Greek logos, is deeper than the global logos. So you might say that Moses and Jesus and Muhammad were responding to logos. The Allah is call of logos. The Yahweh, God, whatever name we use for the Brahman, it's the call of the logos, and all of these names are here. Allah is here. Surrendering to Allah, what are you surrendering? You're surrendering the primacy of a derivative stage of our development as humans to putting first Allah, putting first Yahweh. Love me with all you've got. Why? Because being, reality, is making it possible for us to be. We couldn't be without being. But this space is really eclipsing a deeper intimacy with the source of our being, with reality, with what really is, with being. And to be eclipsed from reality, we saw several themes. That the call to what is first opens up for the first time in history source science. The long quest for first philosophy, a name from Aristotle. What is it? To get the grammar of being. Why? Because when you understand the DNA and the grammar of being, you'll understand everything, every word, every narrative, every way of life, positive and negative, nihilism, atheism, theism, deism, whatever the ism is. You couldn't have it without that. Every narrative, every pulse of life cannot be outside of the logosphere, of the Om sphere, of the Yahweh sphere, of the Allah sphere, of the Brahman sphere, of Om, of the Buddha sphere, whatever name. And so that's what we're going to bring out now. So this is huge. We never had the code notation, so they were conflated. If you erase it temporarily from the mind. If you erase this from the mind, and we have no code markers, then we're in code chaos. This code is conflated with this code, and in the marketplace of life, as great as we are, we humans on our journey into source, right? When the codes are conflated, then when this voice, when the logos and the first responders speak to us here in this derivative language, we naturally process it and translate it into our terms, our will, what we see, our form of meaning. We translate this language here, but this language, profound. To get the logic of being, the grammar of being, that's first science. So in that respect, Buddha, in breaking through to enlightenment and saying to exist is to suffer, and it has a cause. So the cause is our mind operating process. It has malware. He didn't put it that way because he didn't have the codes. They were conflated. So great teachers are trying to find a way to speak to this version of the human being and meaning and reason and how we make sense of the world here with a language that they were opening up and pioneering as first responders. So Buddha's language of emptiness, he calls it emptiness, shunyata, the infinite field of where everything is interconnected. You can't have separate pieces. Everything is interwoven, and we are interwoven with each other and with nature and with logos. It's an intimate space of being with the source. So several major headlines are happening with the notation, which we didn't have before, because we see, well, we're living in a conflated age. All of our great teachers, we didn't have that clearly. Buddha didn't have this clearly. Jesus didn't have this clearly. When Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he was breaking through to the logos in the flesh, speaking this logos language. But people here, when they saw it, it put this information. So the gospels here are good news. That's Google space. It's not news. But this gospel here, it requires the gospel language of God, the language of the logos language. And that's a breakthrough. So Jesus was breaking through as a first responder to the logos grammar and speaking it in the flesh. Because here you can't talk about it. Here you can talk about Jesus. You can talk about God. You could talk about the infinite. But here you have to surf it. You've got to be in the zone of being. And the great first responders got that and felt the frustration of how do I speak this language to this mind and this level. So imagine that with the notation, a major of Gangadean's life, it's the end of an age of conflation, code conflation. Very serious. Code conflation means the codes were mushed, they were not clearly differentiated, and yet both are operating. We're living here, but trading off of this because we couldn't be without being. So they're all together in an undifferentiated code chaos. Imagine the end of the age of conflation, 2,500 years across the planet. Our great first philosophers, teachers, and humans, and living our cultures, were conflated and couldn't see and have a clear way to differentiate the voice and the language and our being, to be a self here. And the call to be, know thyself here, not here as a separate, legoized, objectified entity. Being here is not being. I don't want to repeat. I'm finding challenge to just repeat the first themes for the first three to remind us of where we are. So to sum up, what are some of the headlines of the first three trailers of the posthumous narrative of what did Gangadean bring through as a first global philosopher, and finding the notation and building on the shoulders and the lives and the brilliance of our great first responders over the ages. They were all with him in order to see this. He made that clear in his life. It was not his ego that was seeing this. He was entering and living with the great global first responders over the 2,500 years, taking out of the silos that they were in and seeing, wow, they were all responding to an Unum power source, the source of all. What is infinite is the source of all in this infinite space. And that is source science. So first philosophy is discovery finally in the realization of the missing source science and overcoming the auto shredding and silo making of being in the conflated code situation and by default being under the sway of the red zone and not being able to then cross it and see the deep link. And who are our great first responders? They're not official philosophers. Yes, we could say Socrates is the first philosopher. Aristotle called out first philosophy. Plato sees we've got to get to the logos in the Greek. Descartes in his Meditations on First Philosophy, that's the title of his book. And I'm speaking to people in the public, my biographer in this posthumous narrative from this trailer number 4, which is called Our First Responders. After we have the source science, the UnumPluribus science, and uncovering the logic of reality and being here, and seeing the contrast with the stage where humans have been living and struggling with in the code conflation. So deconflation with the code markers is the end of the age of conflation. It's the disclosure of source science, which is a major monumental breakthrough of all our first responders through the ages. We were all seeking, they were all seeking to get the grammar of the logos, the code of the logos. That's be the code of all codes, the logo of all logos. Every language couldn't be without the influence of the infinite logosphere. So these are some of the headlines we brought out in the first 3 trailers to assist the biographer of bringing out Gangadean's contribution in a global space over 2,500 years of the human enterprise of attempting to respond to and make our crossing into the place of our primary being, of what is first. And we didn't even have the language and the tools and the differentiation of the different mental operating codes. These are mental operating processes. It's like software for the mind. This is software for the mind. Buddha is using this software and sees that this leads to suffering and breakdown and human dysfunction. Jesus is the code in the flesh, logos of the flesh. Krishna is speaking this code. Moses is at the burning bush and seeking to bring the laws down to the people. And Jesus is attempting to build on that and said, if you understood the prophets and the forefathers from Abraham to Moses, you would understand this shift to the call to respond to Yahweh and putting Yahweh first. And you needed the Christ voice, the Christ language as a first responder. So Descartes, when his meditations on first philosophy, was an amazing moment in this journey, in this story, as a first responder of consciously attempting to get to the deepest level of the source of what is first. He had a dream as a 23-year-old that changed his life, a vision of a universal grammar, of a source of all science, a foundation of science. And if you go beyond Descartes to Spinoza and Leibniz and Locke and Hume and Kant, another great moment as a first responder, trying to find a way to go from phenomena to noumena, but we don't have the language for that. And the moral self is a noumenal self. The moral self is a free will, but the everyday cause and effect world of phenomena Kant saw. I'm just jumping ahead quite a bit. I know I'm bringing up a lot, but I'm trying to give yourself who are the, and so after Kant, Hegel, or Geistwissenschaft, Geist is the name for infinite spirit, and trying to retell the story of the evolution of humans and history to Geist. That's the dialectical movement. So Hegel is also a first responder struggling in the conflated space to open the pathway to Geist. Nietzsche was very deeply critical because Nietzsche is very, very interesting, and he's seeing we've got to go beyond good and evil and upgrade to be a mensch. And he was very frustrated that you could see the frustration in Nietzsche's life, in not having clear codes to express, and yet struggling to somehow instinctively bring this out, and yet speaking to the culture from within, and seeing that you philosophers speak of truth, but all I see is personal confession, opinion, projections, gaslight, sophistry. So Nietzsche and Husserl, attempting in phenomenology to pick up on Descartes' breakthrough and to see that something amazing happened with René Descartes. And he opened up the lens that is just looking and observing the mind. You're not from here, not just looking at a phenomena in the everyday world, but minding the minding, which is when you start to see this and you can step back the deeper lens here and just check out how the mind is flowing, how the world is flowing, how your mind is processing, right? When you begin to see this code operating. And of course, from Husserl, we have Jean-Paul Sartre and Heidegger, And on the other side, we have the breakthrough of mathematical logic with Frege and Russell and Wittgenstein, opening up amazing story. I'm not going to get into all of them. Just Gangadean did that in great depth in his classes, over 50 years, with all of these great names that I'm mentioning. They may mean nothing to the general public when the biographer attempts to pick out the the major headlines of Gangadean's journey as a first global philosopher. So there's something first going on here. We have source science, we have the code. It's the end of the age of conflation. We see that in the lower place is all the great first responders who are attempting in common cause, although they were in silos before. The silos, when you cross this, the silos are overcome, and you begin to see the convergence of them being in common cause of responding to the call of the infinite source. Excuse me. So we have source science. These are headlines that changes all of human history. The end of the age of conflation is huge because we can see, as we saw in the third trailer, that why do humans suffer in all kinds of ways? Medical ontology. That ontology, the science of being, is medical. Buddha was doing medicine. He said people are broken and suffering, fragmented, existentially, not just psychologically and physically and biologically, but ontologically, existential suffering caused by malpractice of the mind. And we didn't get that. And we had to really come into the Buddha space to end the suffering. This is suffering. This is the end of suffering. This is nirvana. This is samsara. Lord Krishna is speaking the Om language to Arjuna, the broken warrior on the battlefield, and giving him the technology of yoga to cross from fragmentation and mental breakdown of his life crisis, that everyone in the red zone is going to experience and does experience. You can't thrive here. So Krishna was the first responder, helping Arjuna, the everyday person, to get the technology to enter the Om, yoga technology. So Krishna is responding to the Logos. Buddha is responding to the Logos. Moses, responding to the Logos. Jesus, Logos in the flesh, responding to the Logos. Muhammad, responding to the Logos, to Allah. Excuse me. To mention a few. These are just a few samples of first responders. So you might say then that even though a first responder is a first philosophy and the quest for the grammar of being may have been a philosophy thing of Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, and beyond, Heidegger, and the existentialists, philosophers who are questing being. And Heidegger is a great example because Heidegger in his early career wrote a remarkable, after his teacher Husserl, that opened up the shift to phenomenology. These are fancy words that my biographer will have to deal with. But he saw, Heidegger did in Sein und Zeit, being in time. He first like to attempt for humans to find being here. It's not Sein, but Zeit, but Dasein. And then in his later career, he began to see, no, we're still on the way to being. The themes of his book, on the way to language, on the way to source, on the way to being. There are two kinds of thinking Heidegger discovered, clarified. In the peak of his career, there's calculative thinking, information processing, Google space, and meditative thinking. That's when we're in the zone of being. And his later work was all in this cross. It's a great example of a first philosopher. So we don't have to have official philosophers like Kant and Heidegger, Husserl and Descartes and Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. That's a very noble. That is to be appreciated as one of the great highways of philosophers, a journey of first philosophy, peaking in a thinker like Heidegger, who appreciated the philosophers before Socrates, Heidegger, Hegel and Parmenides. They were more in touch with this. He felt, and in his peak of his career, saying, "This is where we're human." So whether it's Moses listening to the call of Yahweh is responding to Logos, Jesus responding to the call of the infinite and crossing more deeply as a logos in the flesh is a responder to logos, the first responder. Lao Tzu in the Chinese classical and Zhuangzi, these geniuses, the Tao that is named is not the Tao. We're opening the way to Tao, with the yin and the yang and the interconnectivity of the flow in the deep space. The Tao is not the Tao, the name. You can't name God. If you name God, you're violating, because when you bring God into our language, our objectified legomental space, and you name God or speak of the infinite, it's self-deconstructing. It doesn't work. This is the space of theos, of God, of theology, of deep ontology, of cosmology. So I guess by just rehearsing some of the great breakthroughs, source science is medical ontology. This is a medical issue that if we're in this stage of culture and life and self-making and human relations and politics, the USA here is not the same as the USA here. Would you consider the founding of the Declaration of Independence to be the call of logos and tapping into the logos? And not, and so that Jefferson and the community of men and women who are founding fathers and mothers were tapping in and listening to and responding first responders to the logos. Why would you say that? If you were, as we shown before, and one of the things Gangadean did with his son Nathan, in partnership, they published, because I'm speaking as Gangadean, but seeking to step back and help and coach a biographer to have the competence and literacy to adequately represent to the public after he's gone what were the major breakthroughs and contributions of Gangadean's life in concert with all of our great first responders of history, taken out of their silos and seen as responders to what is first, as first responders to the call of Logos Sophia. Sophia is here, of course. Sophia is Logos, Logos Sophia. Sophia is the embodiment of wisdom in being. But that's Logos. So Logos Sophia is one name. It's UnumPluribus. Pluribus means multiplicity in unity. So one of the points is every word in this language has an analog here. Every word here has a higher, deeper, original meaning. This is original script. This is derivative script. If you read scripture here, it's derivative. If you read scripture here, then you're getting to the original word. If you read the Constitution here and the 1776 founding here, right, you're missing a deeper way. Is USA here? Or is USA the land of the free? Unum Pluribus. E pluribus unum. Out of the many and diversity, one. One nation under logos, indivisible. Not one nation under God. It fell apart here. This version of the holy experiment for USA crumbled, as recent developments have shown. It's not over, because we have to learn in the American experiment, the holy experiment, and the call of the 1776 founders, that they were responding to self-evident truth of we're gifted by logos, we humans, with the rights, the human rights of life, liberty, well-being. Not the Lego sapien version of ourselves, but the rational being. And to become a full, mature, rational being, we have to really become mindful and sourceful and resourceful. So the 1776ers were blessed to be first responders listening. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we're endowed by God's nature, nature's God, by the source. And they were responding to the collective wisdom of humanity. It's right there in the words. My respectful of the wisdom of mankind. What's the wisdom of mankind? This story we're speaking. If the founders, 1770, were saying, this, the human being here, we form governments to protect that person. The independence and dignity of a human being as a person, as a logos kid, as a logos person. Right? We form governments to protect that. Governments serve that being. And they point out that if at any time, whatever form of government we're under is violating that human, with human rights, the right to be, the right to reason, the democratic demos, the demos here, the people, the demosocracy, demos, we the people. It's not here, it's scattered, it's broken. But we the people here are deep dialogue, not monologue, but dialogue and diversity, and yet being able to be nonviolent in the awakened culture of the logosphere as a nation under logos. For all people, this is not just USA, this is all people across the planet are under the logos. Everyone is under the logos, which is the infinite source. And as long as we're under this ceiling and even enforcing it here, we're performing great harm to our human genome as logos children of logos. and so culture must move from here to there. And that's so again, that's just I keep trying to recollect the headlines. We have source science now. So if democracy is here, it's not based upon our will and what we choose and what we like and what we prefer and so forth. And I vote for this. Voting here is not voting here. To be a competent voter, you have to be a rational being, mindful of derivative ways of thinking. And if we take an oath to uphold the Constitution, then we have to really be willing to step back from privileging our narrative and our party and our ideology, because this is the life of ideology. This is the life of reason. That's what Gangadean was bringing up in the 9 episodes he and his son published in 2020 before the election. All of this came out with supplements that 1776 was pointing here. The holy experiment is to move from this pre-democracy, pre-rational, to a mature, rational human being culture, the demos, we the people here. Obviously, it didn't work out here. We couldn't do it because something was blocking and culture wars and ideologies and party lines and through conflicts of interests and judges who couldn't step back from their own orientation to enter into the Supreme Court and judge without prejudice. Officers in the White House, president, taking an oath, senators and congressmen and women, taking an oath to uphold the law of logos, of ethics, of the founding of the USA democracy. Demos is here. So the word democracy is small d, democracy here. Being human, saying I here is not the same as a human. Law here is not the same as law. Everyone's under the law. And people are terrified of crossing out of this comfort zone, which is a disaster in terms of our human flourishing and well-being. Well-being is here. Ill-being is here. Our being is ill in this mind-operating technology, which fragments and breaks and separates into units. And we didn't know the medical consequences. So the third trailer dared to show with medical ontology, source science, that the human condition without the code emerging, the end of conflation, we couldn't see that profound dysfunctions in the human culture's life in this technology of malware of the mind and culture making and self-making and politics and raising our children has been a kind of disaster of ill-being. This is huge. So first philosophy, source science, is a medical science, medical ontology, a deeper breakthrough of diagnostic power. With this language, we can now diagnose more deeply why things like the breakdown of human relations and wars and Holocaust and genocide and misogyny and mythology. Mythology is the fear of reason. People are terrified in this almost pre-rational state of emotional living by my will, what I want, what I need, me first. Life, even though we're good people and we're always under the influence. The point is that human beings have always had access to the source. And the greatest geniuses and scientists and performing artists and designers and musicians of all kinds, the genius is traceable to when individuals got into the zone spontaneously. Why? Because we're always in the zone. That's what this insignia was saying. Where we are here, we always are under the influence. Culture is always living under the influence. That's why the 1776ers finally were saying, let's open the land of the free. Let's have we the people self-governance. We can manage our own life. Let's form a form of self-governance now that is not an external force governing us, but we be free in the space of the land of the free. So, ironically, in trying to recap the first three trailers in this fourth one, which is what? First responders. But we can't understand why they're called first responders and why as diverse as Moses and Jesus and Muhammad and Socrates and Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, Buddha. Buddha is a first responder, and Nagarjuna was opening up the logic to show that this collapses, and this is the way, the middle way to the Buddha language. And Buddhist of teachings going through Tibet and Nepal into China, Chan Buddhism, and into Japan, Zen. So from Buddha to Zen, that's a long, noble trail of the teaching initiated by Buddha, Gautama, right, as a first responder. Over 2,500 years maturing. But we can't put Zen in the Allah tradition of Muhammad. As that matured into the Middle Ages of Ibn Arabi, seeing that there's one where he was still under the influence. He was conflated, but the call of the Arabic first philosopher geniuses like Ibn Arabi were, as with Spinoza, for example, seeing the unity, the Unum, the call of the Unum. And Rumi, the great philosopher poet, is a first responder. When he was saying, there's a field beyond judgment and right and wrong. I'll meet you there. The call of them, his poetic genius, as an example of a great first responder. The Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, was attempting to really decode and break through with the code, the God code, the Yahweh code. Amazing developments of first responders, and they have something profoundly in common. It's a call of the UnumPluribus, call of the infinite, or the technology of yoga, of the Vedic science. It was called Vedic science, the Upanishadic tradition of the yogis who are seeing into the depths by meditating. This is called predication. Google information. Language is predication, calculation. But meditation is a deeper mind operating process. Meditation cannot go on here in the ego-based privileging of the ego, Lego self under the sway of a code that's blocking the yoga. Yoga is here. So the centuries of the Vedic science, of the science of Brahman, the science, Veda is knowledge. And the yogi tradition is Vedic tradition of knowledge, of science. It's source science to get to Brahman, the source, Om. So from the rishis, last thousands of years ago, through the Bhagavad Gita of Krishna, speaking the Om voice to Arjuna here across the code, it was a code shift. The yoga. and beyond, all through the ages of the Vedic science and the Hindu philosophical tradition of brilliant philosophers through the ages, Shankaracharya, 7th century, Advaita Vedanta. Vedanta is Veda, the end of the Vedas. And he saw that Brahman, the trail of Brahman, is non-dual. It's Advaita. This is dual and fragmentation and separation. But when you enter the yoga space of the Vedic science, of source science, it's Advaita, non-dual. Brahman rules, Logos rules. For example, and beyond Shankara, all the way to Aurobindo, 20th century, genius of opening even more deeply as a first responder, who was in prison for years and studying the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, and in his mature philosophical vision, divine science, was opening up and building on the tradition. And going into Zen, from Buddha to Zen, through Tibet and China into Japan. In Japan, the Kyoto school of Zen, of Nishida, attempting to get the logic of emptiness, the logic of Basho. Basho, Shunyata. What is the logic of emptiness, of presence? What is the grammar of presence? It's Nishida. And he, on his deathbed, he was saying it to his colleagues, you're still not getting it. You're not understanding my logic of emptiness. You're using your logic to read my logic and bring me down here. You're not getting my Zen logic. In a way, it's tragic. But these are all first responders. I'm daring to include the Quakers. From Jesus, all through the centuries of the great theologians, Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, and and the mystical Christians and the Gnostic tradition, and going through the Catholic and the Protestant Reformation, and from the Protestant Reformation to the Quaker Revolt, and founding and coming into Pennsylvania in America, and having an influence on the Quakers in Penn's Woods, Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods. William Penn was a Quaker. What's a Quaker? It's a Christian mystic that sees that God is in every person. Wow. So from Jesus, 2,000 years later, the Quakers are saying it's not in the cross, it's not in the written Gospels, it's not in the altar, it's not in the politics of religion, the Pope, it's not an ideology, it's here. They're called, it's a nickname to call them Quakers. It's really the Society of the Friends of Truth. What are the Friends of Truth? Because they see that truth is not our opinion, it's not our belief system, it's not our narrative, it's not our ideology, it's deeper. It lives in us. That's what Jesus was. I am the truth, I'm the way, I'm the life. And Quakers followed that logic and founded the college that I've been teaching in and at. That's, would be the biographer that I'm helping right now, would speak of some of the data of Gangadean's life. He entered Haverford College, founded by the Quakers. Who are the Quakers? The Christians who began to recognize that the infinite is within us, and we are within the infinite. It's not that the infinite is in us, but we are in the infinite, we're here. Let's form a college with the honor code. What's the honor code? Honor one another. Honor first is first. And enter into mindful education. And that's one of the things that Gangadean was accomplishing over 5 decades and more in his life as a professor of global philosophy at Haverford College, and developing the Margaret Guest Center for dialogue, deep dialogue across worlds, exploring their diversity and bringing out their unity. Imagine a center, the Margaret Guest Center, that he was from the very beginning, around 1972, all till as his career unfolded over decades as a Margaret Guest professor. So I hope this 4th trailer, First Responders, we're calling it, to help the prospective biographer get an inside story from a posthumous narrative, allegedly, that I'm experimentally trying to help and coach, not from Gangadean's perspective, but from this perspective. How would you present that to the public who do not have this code shift and to understand language here without translating it here? How do you convey the source science, the medical ontology, the discovery of a deeper original language that our great first responders, which were before in silos and separated, but remove the silos when you cross here, and you see that all of these many great traditions that I've been bringing out were responding to the Logos. They were first responders to the call of Logos, which is an infinite call to every point within this field of being. Every point, everyone in this cultural space is still under the influence of the infinite call of the Logos. We don't have to use God talk. It doesn't have to be religion. It's science, it's ontological science, source science. First philosophy is source science. And with the end of the age of conflation and having the technology, it's a monumental breakthrough, because if one is a Christian here, there's a deeper way to find Christ, because Jesus is Jesus is Jesus. What's that? Christ speaking. What's that? The Logos in the flesh. Buddha? Buddha is the Dharma, the Sangha, the Buddha, not a Buddha here as an objectified entity. Buddha was breaking through this stage of technology, of consciousness, this form of mind operating, to going into a more healthful, fractal space of being, of surfing being with a higher code power, source code. We need the source code to surf the source, and that's when we're no longer a self here. We're a self that's woven into the entire field of the flow of being. So it's monumental what Gangadean was doing. And in this fourth trailer, to enhance the first three, in this one, in this posthumous narrative, I'm seeking to advise a prospective narrator, and Gangadean is gone. What did he do? What was his contribution? And to see that the first responders, just to see that widely diverse first responders were in common cause, just to take down the silos of our great traditions and see that all of these first names, these great first names, must meet in the infinite unified force of the UnumPluribus. So the human culture here, and all of our narratives and all of our scriptures here, are opening up now to a much more profound reading than we had before. We're almost, this code was blocking the deeper code. It's almost as if we're finally getting the Logos code to tap scriptures, first narratives. So Descartes being read here is a deeper Descartes if you read it meditatively. If you read the Gospels here, is a deeper gospel, Gnostic gospel. If you understand the laws brought by Moses and you understand Moses here, it's profound. And the lineage connected between Moses and Jesus and Muhammad, children of Abraham, children of Logos. So the true self is not in our belief systems and ideologies and narratives and CVs that we have in this mental space across the planet. There's widely diverse narratives that we can have and do have in a widely diverse languages and ethnic orientations and belief systems and disciplines of the liberal arts education, all of our disciplines, the economic language, physics and chemistry, computer science, neurology, astronomy, philosophy, they're all here. Well, they're all disciplines, and you could look at the different languages of these disciplines, but with transdisciplinary intelligence. We have money here in economics, but what would logonomics be? Logos value, for example. So I don't know how long I have gone on. You may think too long, but I'm trying to help the biographer with a posthumous inside glimpse of how to represent Gangadean's contribution as a first philosopher. And I'm trying to share with you and with the biographer, not a biographer here, but a biographer here. Not a CV here, but beyond the CV, to really encounter the breakthrough to source medical ontology. And why finally, and this builds upon our great first responders who are all together. And Gangadean saw himself over decades of living in these great traditions and seeing that they're responding as first responders to the call of the infinite first. That had to be UnumPluribus. So Yahweh and Allah and Brahman and Om and Tao and God and Shunyata and Buddha Dharma, the Dharma of Buddha, the language of Buddha, can't be fragmented. They're converging as first responders. So let this fourth coaching trailer, posthumous voice, try to make sense of Gangadean's contribution in an Unum narrative, not a narrative here, but there's an Unum power, a unified power working and calling all through Gangadean's life that enabled him to really get the hologram and to bring through source science finally by essentially listening to our great first responders and building on their amazing contributions. and to see that the destiny of our human journey has to be where our first responders were leading and pointing, now seen in a global light, in an Unum light. We must move from a place of suffering and violence and fragmentation and self-violations and violating our children, because our children are sacred beings. We are sacred beings. How do someone parent? The parent here is not the same as parenting here. A child-centered sacred space. This is sacred space. This is desecrated. Why? By the malpractice and malware of the mind and the culture making here. Has a built-in virus. It's just a COVID, it's CodeVid, a code virus. And that's one of the greatest contributions of Gangadean's journey, is to bring in the medical ontology in order to diagnose what the great first responders were speaking and trying to expose of the breakdown of the human here and facing life and death issues and human relations and politics and so forth, and seeking that here, but always under the influence. And that our journey through the pathways of our first responders is finally the liberation of the human family. Will that happen? That's a question we're facing. By that, I hope that gives you a sense of Gangadean's journey as a first responder in a global light, a global first responder, listening deeply and bringing together these widely diverse first narratives that are all responders to the call of Pluribus. I'll leave it there for now. And just to say that this is a trailer. And in his decades of work as a pioneering first philosopher, and his teachings and public performances and writings, books, essays, and so forth, Gangadean went in great detail into, for example, seeing Descartes here and Descartes here, to seeing Plato and Aristotle and going more deeply, to seeing Jesus and going into the Logos in the flesh, Christianity here and Christianity here, Islam here, Islam here, Hindu wisdom here and Hindu wisdom in the yoga, yoga here and yoga here, on and on, science here, science here. That source science is the foundation of science. Education here and education here. Gangadean's work as an educator was to show that education that does not face the code issue remains compromised, and the liberal arts had to be liberated from the bondage of a presumed mind operating processing that was not minded sufficiently according to our great first teachers and first responders. So code education is a shift from code here to code here. And that is a human right for education. And you don't have to go to college and pay high tuitions at the university in order to be open to public education. Everyone should be educated with baby ontology, the science of being, to know that being here is compromised and the source of widespread human pathologies and malpractice. And that the rise of being mindful from unminding to mind your minding and breaking the barrier, breaking the trance, and moving in the call of our great first responders into the healthful space of deep dialogue culture, mutual respect, putting source first, honoring what's first, honoring each other in non-violent ways, because this is inherently violence of objectification and spawning widespread human suffering here. So everything that we've known is up for a deeper renovation. Just I'll part with that. Gangadean shows that every word in our everyday linguistic derivative space has a deeper meaning. And when we tap the deeper meaning, like democracy to democracy, being Christian to being Christian, Jesus to Jesus, Christ to Christ, yoga to yoga, on and on. After the age of conflation is let go, and the code intelligence and code education arises as public education for all human beings across the planet. Thank you for listening, and I hope this helps the biographer to be able to represent and present some of the highlights of Gangadean's life. Thank you very much.